All right, I think we'll get started. Looks like we have quite a few people here, so that's great. Thank you guys for coming to our first virtual Lunch and Learn lecture. I definitely see a lot of familiar faces, and I see a few new ones, so that's great. First, I just wanted to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn lectures. If you haven't been to them before, typically they're in person, and they are in our Hugh Gregg Conservation Center. We have guest speakers in the winter, January, February, and March, and then also sometimes during the summer. And it's a great way to learn something new. My name is Melissa, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And for those of you that don't know who we are a state and federal partnership between New Hampshire Fish and Game and NOAA, and we're part of a national network of reserves. So there are 29 reserves around the country. The closest one to us is in Wells, Maine. So you may have been there since that's practically our backyard. Just so everybody knows, this lecture will be recorded and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel so that people who aren't able to attend will be able to see the lecture and learn about the property. And for now, everybody's going to remain on mute except for the speakers, just to prevent any sort of distraction with background noise. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and I will be monitoring that. And we may take a break or two during the lecture, or we may wait until the end. It kind of depends on the questions. And I will ask those questions of Cory or Nadine, and I'll make sure that everyone's question gets answered. Also, I don't anticipate needing to do this, but we will remove attendees if necessary. So I don't think we'll need to, but just in case everybody knows that. So I think I'll introduce our speakers now. Cory, if you could forward the slide. Great. So one of our speakers today is Nadine Miller. She's the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources. So basically, she oversees federally funded and permitted project review and assists agencies in determining the effects of historic resources. So because our Glen Cove property has quite a deep history in this area, we were able to work with her to assess that. She really enjoys working with stakeholders to identify preservation tools and to help protect to help protect significant resources, and then also opportunities like this for the public to appreciate historic properties through workshops and lectures. Go ahead, Cory. And then Cory Riley is the reserve manager at Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and she oversees all of the sectors within the reserve, so education, research, stewardship, and coastal training program coordinators. And she also works closely with partners to help promote clean water and healthy coastal habitats in the Great Bay region. And one of her favorite places on the reserve is actually the High Marsh Field at the Glen Cove property. And before coming to Great Bay, Cory worked for NOAA and was a liaison for the East Coast Reserve. So she also has a long history of working in this area. And I'm going to hand it over to Cory now.
Great. So the first thing I want to do is thank Melissa for her work on this Lunch and Learn and for all of them. It's wonderful to see all of you here today, and we hope we can do more of these virtual Lunch and Learns. So again, thank you, Melissa, and thanks everybody for coming today. Basically, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this property came to Fish and Game and how it intersects with our mission, and how we secured funding to do some work to the property. Then Nadine is going to jump in to tell us about how historical resources are reviewed and analyzed in the context of these state projects. And then we'll dig into the history of the former Emery Farm itself. And then I'll wrap up by telling everybody a little bit about what we hope to do there in the future. And as Melissa mentioned, please type any questions into the chat and we will address the questions towards the end of our presentation. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will start. So the first thing that I'm going to do is sort of breeze through a little bit of background about the reserve, because that's going to really link back to what our goals for this property are. So as a quick reminder for those of you who don't know us very well, we are a Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. There are 29 National Estuarine Research Reserves around the country, as you can see on this map, and all of them are a state-federal partnership. So each of them has technical assistance and funding that comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but they have a state partner that implements the programs in a locally relevant way. So here in New Hampshire, the state partner is New Hampshire Fish and Game. So we manage over 2,500 acres around Great Bay, and those are all wildlife management areas of New Hampshire Fish and Game. We have a visitor center and a conference center. Those buildings belong to New Hampshire Fish and Game. So we all work for New Hampshire Fish and Game. So we're part of New Hampshire Fish and Game, but we get this chunk of money from NOAA and a lot of assistance from NOAA to stay within the guidelines of this national program, this network of protected places around the country. All of these protected places were created by the Coastal Zone Management Act in the early 70s, specifically to be platforms for long-term research, places to connect people to estuaries and increase awareness and education about estuaries, and they're a place to demonstrate projects or do research that's relevant to coastal management more broadly. So with that in mind, there are certain things that every reserve around the country does and that we do in a way that's New Hampshire specific here. So all reserves around the country, and we do it here, do research and monitoring on estuarine water quality and habitat. So we have 4 water quality stations around Great Bay. We do work on salt marshes, on oysters, on stormwater. So we have a research and monitoring program. We also have a very active education program. We see over 5,000 school children a year in our school field trips, and we do summer training programs for teachers to get them out into the estuary to do hands-on learning and bring that back into the classroom. We manage our own lands, and we do that in a way that is science-based, in a way where we can be a good demonstration site for things like restoration, invasive species removal, and any other natural resource type of issue that is relevant in our state. We also provide sort of planning resources for other natural resource managers using science that's developed by our staff. We have a program called the Coastal Training Program that does technical assistance to local decision makers. And local decision makers are things like volunteer boards in your communities, local businesses, or state agencies. And the goal of that program is to bring science-based information to decision makers who may be making decisions that could impact water quality or habitat around Great Bay. And finally, we do quite a bit of public programming, especially this year during the pandemic. But even in a typical year, we see over 15,000 people who come to walk our grounds, to participate in the programs that we have, starting from toddlers all the way through public programs like this one. Our visitor center is open to the public and free, and it's a great resource for families in southern New Hampshire. We could not do any of this work without the dedicated work of our volunteers. We have an amazing group of people who are very committed to this reserve. We have people who come volunteer their time all the time. And we also have a very active friends group, the Great Bay Stewards. So we are very grateful for the support that we have from our community members here in the Great Bay region. So next, I just want to make sure people know where we're talking about this as Nadine starts talking about the property and we discuss our plans. So on the left-hand side, you see a map that shows green areas. Those are all the wildlife management areas in the Great Bay region. Those within that red boundary are ones that are currently a part of the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. The star is where our visitor center is, the Great Bay Discovery Center. So some of you on this phone call have probably been there or are familiar with that site. And the circle represents the property that we will be discussing today. It's going to get a little confusing because there are 2 names for it. Glen Cove is the name of the collection of properties that you see on the right-hand side of your screen right now. All of those properties are owned and managed by the New Hampshire Fish and Game. The green pieces that you see have all been managed by Fish and Game since around 2000. Some of them have agricultural fields on them, and they are a partnership between a farmer and Fish and Game. So the farmer is allowed to hay, and they also implement best practices for wildlife. The yellow piece that you see is the former Emery Farm. And that is what we'll be discussing today as far as the historical buildings and site of a lot of agriculture in the Great Bay region. However, all of these properties really fall into the same historical category as far as lands that were traditionally farmed in this area. And when we think about how we interpret this site in the future, we're really going to be interpreting this whole sort of region of this coastline of Great Bay. So I will just say that the reason why the map has green areas and a yellow area is because each of these lands was purchased in the early, like I said, between 1999 and 2001, and they were separate parcels. The parcel where you see the yellow towards Great Bay, that had several buildings on it, and when it was purchased from the bay all the way into the road. So the green space that is to the, I guess on your map, it's to the east of that yellow piece. That was all one parcel, but the part that was yellow was put into a life estate. So what that meant is although Fish and Game owned the property, there was an agreement that the family could live on that property until the family contact passed away, and then it would revert to 100% New Hampshire Fish and Game management of that part of the property. So although New Hampshire Fish and Game has owned that yellow piece since the late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't really do anything to that property or manage it. We let the family live there and do what they were doing with that property. So I just want to show people what that looks like today. If you were standing where this yellow arrow is in front of you, you would see the farmhouse and the garage, which is at the top. And if you look slightly to the right, you would see that barn that you see below. I'm giving you a quick orientation in hopes that that'll help set the context for Nadine's presentation and also let you know what's there now so you can envision the future. There's also 3 cottages and a former turkey poult coop that was converted to apartments. So on the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side is the apartment, and on the top is one of the 3 cabins, and I've pointed to that with a yellow arrow on the map. The pink arrow points to where the apartments are now. Moving right along, the orange arrow is affiliated with the cabin that you see on the top of your screen on the right-hand side, and the bottom cabin is the green arrow. And you'll see that that green cabin is in much better condition than the rest of the cabins because it was rebuilt. I believe in 2013, 2012, there was a cabin right there that burned down, and at the time the family decided to rebuild this cabin here. So basically what happened was in 2018, the family member that was affiliated with the life estate passed away. And at that time, New Hampshire Fish and Game became the manager of the entire parcel, including all of these buildings. Most of these buildings were rented at the time or being used as residences. And so there was about a year-long process to give people transition time to find other housing. And then there was a whole lot of cleanup that needed to happen to vacate the buildings of any belongings, et cetera, that were left behind. The buildings are not in good condition. And so we had to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with the overall property? We wanted to make sure that we aligned with New Hampshire Fish and Game interests in this property going back, and they were interested in public access opportunities here. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful place to go. And it has a historic smelt fishing access point that could be a kayak accessing point in the future. Obviously, they're interested in the salt marsh habitat and the near shore habitat that this offers. It's as I said, it's a great access point for ice fishing historically, and waterfowling in Great Bay. It could also be an access point for that activity as well. And it's very popular with birders and walkers and people who enjoy passive recreation opportunities around Great Bay. There are not very many public access sites like this on Great Bay where you have such a tremendous view and a place for picnicking, etc. And it's never been open to the public before. So because we're this state-federal partnership, we also have to align with our federal partner, NOAA, and they were very interested in having all reserves around the country have a space for visiting researchers. And they made this a new initiative a few years ago, along with the initiation of a fellowship program, the Margaret A. Davidson Fellowship, which I could see that our fellow is on the call today. So hi, Anna. And it's part of our deal with NOAA that we will house these people who come to study the reserve and the estuary, but we don't have any place to put them right now. So NOAA basically said, since Great Bay, you don't have a place to put researchers right now, that needs to be a priority for you. Some of the other priorities for NOAA are places to conduct research from, public access and education to connect people to estuaries, and they need to make sure it aligns with a management plan. Now, we just finished our management plan about a year ago, and we knew this property was either going to come to us soon or had just come to us when we were writing that management plan. So we knew that one of the potential uses of this space could be to address some of these facility needs that were important to both Fish and Game and to NOAA. And So there's a competitive funding opportunity that is offered to the reserves every year, which means that the 29 reserves around the country compete for a few $1,000,000 to do high priority land protection or construction activities. So in a nutshell, last year we put together a proposal for this property to create public access, to create a visiting researcher space, and to enhance our ability to do education programming at this site and research. So it required 30% state match, which we are very grateful to New Hampshire and Fish and Game because they did come up with that match. And we had the highest ranked proposal of anyone in the nation, which I'm very proud of. And so one of the first steps you need to do when you receive federal funding to do any sort of renovation on a property is make sure that you're aligned with the Division of Historic Resources and that you make sure that you're preserving the architectural and archaeological resources on the site. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Nadine so she can tell you a little bit more about how that works in New Hampshire and what we've found out about this property during that process.
Thank you. Well, I'm not surprised that you guys were the highest folks in that competition because it really, based on your description, ticks off all those boxes that NOAA is looking for, and particularly the housing aspect, because I think it's wonderful that you'll be reusing the house on the property for that purpose. Reusing historic properties is really what helps maintain them. You know, we don't necessarily want to see a bell jar put over the historic properties. It's more about managing change and making them a living part of our landscape. So this is just a perfect example of that. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention before I got started. And one is that I went through my PowerPoint a few minutes before the presentation and noticed a couple of typos. So I apologize for that if you see something that's out of the ordinary. And I also certainly wanted to give a shout out to the consultants who prepared the historical information on this property. And that's Lynn and Cory and staff at the Preservation Company. And I think they may be on the call. So if I say something out of order, please feel free to correct me. But if it weren't for their wonderful research and gathering information and well-written inventory form, we certainly wouldn't have all of the information that we have now. I had the luxury to go out to this property around 2018 when Fish and Game was really just starting to think about what they wanted to do there. And I noticed that it was a beautiful setting. You know, the landscape is simply gorgeous. And the buildings, as Cory mentioned, they're a little in rough shape, a few of them, although they are still certainly recognizable as historic resources. You know, I wasn't really sure whether or not this property would be a significant property as the way we define it. So we, you know, we're again fortunate to have a consultant help prepare information, and it was determined that it was significant. So if you could move the slide along, that would be great. So as Cory mentioned, I work with the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources. We are a small state agency that's part of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And some of you may be familiar with the types of programming that we do. We have 11 staff. And some of the most well-known programs that we run are the National Register of Historic Places in partnership with the National Park Service. We have our own state register of historic places. Our highway marker program is very popular. I'm sure you see those all over the state. We have more than 200 of those. We have our own grants that we administer through the Conservation License Plate or Moose Plate program. And we have an archaeology program in the summer where we accept volunteers to do archaeology work. And I know that we're pulling that together right now. So if that's of interest to you, please check back on our website periodically for those volunteer opportunities. But one of our biggest parts of our job is a regulatory role that we call review and compliance. So if you could turn the slide again. And that role is given to us under a federal law called Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And this was the act that was established in 1966 federally and across the whole country. I'm sure most of you know that around the 60s, we were seeing a lot of highways going through our very historic areas in Boston and other big cities. Some of our public housing projects through HUD were really decimating neighborhoods and historic areas. And so the country came together as part of a lot of environmental laws to create this law. And it is when any federally funded, licensed, or permitted projects come into our state, we have to go through the Section 106 process. We have a similar state review called RSA 227C9 that asks state agencies to cooperate with our office for technical assistance. So there are oftentimes we'll work with Bureau of Public Works or Parks or Fish and Game early on in a project before Section 106 triggers as part of our state review to provide technical assistance. And then when they receive a grant or perhaps permitting to do a project, that's when it kicks into Section 106. And this kicked in because of the NOAA funding. And we are certainly working with NOAA under Section 106 because the lead federal agency is really the decision maker in the Section 106 process. Next slide, please. So the Section 106 process, we see it as a consultative process where we use professionals. We ask the applicant to usually hire professionals to help with the identification of historic properties. The first step usually is that the applicant will send us a request for project review form, and that's something that they can do on their own. We don't need professionals to help them with that. It provides some information, mapping, locational information, what the resources are on the property that they're aware of, whether or not there are impacts to those. Are they tearing things down? Are they building around them? Is there nothing on the property? And we have staff who looks at this information and makes a call as to whether or not there's a need for archaeological studies and whether or not above ground resources might be impacted. And when our archaeologist is looking for that, he is looking both for Native American occupation in the area and also historic occupation. And he's trained to look for that. So in this particular case, there are archaeologists that are on board right now, and they've prepared some archaeological sensitivity studies. And once Fish and Game has a better idea of the exact areas that will be ground disturbed, then the archaeologists that are hired can go in and do some additional testing. Because areas such as this really had a high sensitivity for Native American travel through and occupation and perhaps even burials. So we know that there's probably high sensitivity here. But what we try and do under 106 is if there are historic properties, we try and find ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate. And I do want to reiterate that Section 106 does not in itself stop a project. There have been cases where the public involvement has been so great that a project ends up not followed through, but it wasn't specifically because of the power of the law under Section 106. Next slide. Can we advance to the next slide? There we go. Did we lose it? I think we lost Cory.
Yep, we might have lost her. So sorry about that, guys.
Let me look here and see if I can pull up my presentation and share it if we can't get her back.
That would be great.
I'll just have to figure out how to share the screen. I'm just pulling it up right now. But while I'm pulling that up, talking about this slide, as I mentioned, the first thing we do is ask the applicant to hire professional architectural historians as well as the archaeologists. They're two separate professions to do a survey out at the property to determine whether or not there are historic resources there. And in this case, I'd mentioned the preservation company was hired. They've worked for many, many years in the state. And here we go. Let me get this here. And so they went out and they did an inventory form to be able to document the property. And that's a form that's available on our website. Now, I'm wondering if I can go to share my screen. Here we go. Let's see. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, that came through. So if you start the slideshow.
Yep. There we go.
Perfect.
Great. Let me
Thank
get
you.
to where I was. Okay, crisis averted. So as I mentioned, the first step was to prepare an inventory form of the property. And that is where a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about the history of the property is based. And what the architectural historians do is they gather a lot of research from local repositories and historical societies. They look at historic maps, genealogies, census information to pull the history of the property together. And they go out to the site, they take photographs, they do sketch plans, they really pull the information together and try and figure out, is really there enough information on that property in extant buildings and landscapes that still reflect the history of that property? And in this case, there was. And so the consultant recommended that the property was significant for its history and its farming history. And that form was submitted to our office, and we have a committee that reviews those twice monthly, and we concurred that it was significant. So that means we wanted to work closer with Fish and Game to make sure we were finding ways to protect the property. So the next step under the 106 is to determine whether or not there's an effect on the property. And sometimes effects can actually be positive. We know Fish and Game is really trying to make this site accessible to the public. And that means that they'll probably have to tear down a couple of the cabins because of the condition that they're in, perhaps the barn as well. Those are things we're in discussion with. Maybe move some things around. So that does change the property, and we call that an adverse effect. So once we have an adverse effect, we work again with NOAA and Fish and Game and potentially the public to see if we can find ways to avoid that. If we can't completely avoid it, we try and minimize the impact. And so the way we're minimizing the impact here is that we're going to be working really closely together to rehabilitate the main house on the property, following best preservation practices, using the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. That's the standards at the federal level. Really working together to try and make sure that it's done correctly. And then we know that we'll also still have an adverse effect. So we're going to try and mitigate that. And we felt for this project that interpretation was really a great way to go because of the public access to the site. And so we're going to be working with the Preservation Company on developing some great interpretive tools. So I'll start with the history of the property. And so this is a map from 1892. And you can see the arrow is pointing to the Simpson farm. And it's basically a very close, similar location to the existing buildings that were there. The house, though, that we see now is from 1915, but the property seems to have gone back well before 200 years before that there was a house likely on the property from around the early 1700s, but it burned down in 1915. But in the 19th century, for quite a long time, the Simpson family lived on the property here, and their old house was at the end of the road, very similar to where we see the existing house now. And that's pretty common, building houses either on the same footprint or very close to the same footprint as the older. The Simpson family farmed the land. They had help from a farm laborer who lived with them. And this information was gathered through the US Census. There's agricultural census information and population information, and that is a wonderful source to get names and information about folks who lived at properties during that time. And the types of farming in the area in the 1800s were really the mixed family farm. There was dairying, cattle, hay, harvesting apples. These were some of the agricultural activities that were part of the seacoast at that time. So several generations of the Simpson family owned the farm until about 1900. And at that time, they sold the house and 60 acres of land with buildings to Nancy Badger of Newington. So the Badger or Sherman family, they were related. They owned the property for just a short period of time, from 1901 to 1914. They had a large farm in South Newington where they ran Badger Farms Creamery. And that was the largest dairy business in the Portsmouth area at the time. So if you do a little Google search on them, you can find a lot of the milk bottles and things like that online, which are still available. So they owned this farm, Nancy and her daughter and son-in-law, who were the Shermans, and they lived there with their children. And Joseph Sherman ran the farm, again with a farm laborer, and they boarded with them. That was very common at the time. So that was just a traditional farm. And in July of 1914, Mrs. Badger sold the buildings and the land to brothers who were Benjamin and William Prey, and they were natives of Portsmouth. So the Prey family also wanted to continue in the farming tradition. And once they moved to the property in 1914, they were really getting it ready for the spring planting season. And unfortunately, in the winter of 1914-1915, the house caught on fire and burned down. So it was the Prey family who reconstructed the house in 1915. Like we said, probably on a similar footprint. You can tell when you look at the house, you don't necessarily think 1915. It certainly does look older than that. But Benjamin and his wife Ethel, they were the ones who ended up staying in Greenland and rebuilt the house, while the brother William sold their share of the property to them. When they moved back into the property, it was actually only another year later in 1916 that the barn was destroyed by fire. So there probably was a lot of lightning strikes and things like that out this way. And unfortunately, they lost their cow, they lost 50 hens, 3 tons of hay, but fortunately, several of the horses did survive because they were not in the barn at the time. So here's a picture of the barn that Cory had pointed out. When you're looking at the house, it's to the right, it's a standalone barn. And it certainly is a lot smaller than what we might see in most of big farms in New Hampshire. As we mentioned, it was rebuilt around 1916. Again, similar site, I'm sure, as the original barn. What's interesting about this barn that is not original and appears to be of a later date are the ventilation units that are on the top of the barn. And those were likely from a later date when the barn was heavily used for poultry. And we'll talk about the family did that. They finished and vented the upper floors so that birds could be kept in the area. And as we all know, how kind of smelly, and they needed some ventilation for those. And they added some additional interior levels and windows typical of an early to mid 20th century barn. What's cool too on the site is there's a weather vane up at the top, and you can see it in the narrow picture there. And it bears the name James, and the design of that matches the weather vane and ventilators and catalogs of the time. That was part of the James Manufacturing Company, or James Way. And they produced all types of dairy and poultry equipment and had plans for barns. So that's pretty interesting that we can still see that on the landscape. So the house, what we would call, is the colonial revival style. And the colonial revival style really harkens back to more traditional architecture, particularly from New England. And this style was very popular from 1900 to 1950, but we still see this style today in a lot of new construction when we see what people call New Englanders or colonials or Cape Cods. All of those types of buildings harken back to our early periods of American domestic architecture, but was revived in the early 20th century. So what we know about the colonial revival style, it was after 1876, after the 100 years centennial, when again there was new traditional interest in those types of architectural forms across the United States. And then by the 1890s, when we have the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, It was the Great White City theme, and houses were at that point often painted white. And we see our villages in New Hampshire often with the white paint and the dark green or the black shutters. Most of those houses that predate that time period were painted in much different colors, but we see the white paint today, and that's really from that colonial revival period in the early 20th century. And there are certain elements of this style that we'll see in this building that are drawn out. So I'm going to put this next slide on. Usually they are very symmetrical and formal with a rectangular footprint. Oftentimes they're 2 stories, but they could be a 1 story or a 1.5, like a cape is. And they usually have either a hipped or gable roof with a medium pitch. And this particular house has a side gable roof because the entrance is on the broad side of the gable. Siding was frequently clapboard. I think we have vinyl aluminum siding here, and hopefully we'll be able to work on seeing if we can bring that back to its original siding when we do our rehabilitation work. But of course, in the early 20th century, there was new technologies that made other types of facings of colonial revivals popular too, like brick over the wooden balloon framing. And as I mentioned before, they were often painted white with green, black, or other dark hues. And the facades of these buildings, as I mentioned, are usually symmetrical with a central entry flanked by pairs of windows, which we see here. They often have porches either on the front or sometimes the side with delicate columns, not as fancy as some of the earlier styles like the Italian or the Greek Revival or the Victorian. It was really getting back to much more simplicity from those styles of the 1880s. And the front doors usually had a fan light or side lights and sometimes oval windows, which this particular one does have. And the interior of these buildings too also usually had nice classical elements. Again, nothing necessarily really fancy that we would see in Victorians, a much lighter and softer look. But this particular house has some very nice elements that I hope, again, when we work on the rehabilitation plan, that we can maintain, including the staircase with the newel post and the spindles and the lovely fireplace that has some really soft details there. You know, knowing that there likely is a lot of lead paint and other sorts of environmental factors on the inside, we certainly work together on that. But there are proven preservation practices that we can use to rehab the house, and oftentimes doing that can cost less than, you know, building new. So after the Prey family owned the property, the Kennard family showed up. And I think they were a real interesting family here. They owned the property from 1919 to 1935. And the picture on the right shows Reginald Kennard, and he was the big poultry farmer here. It falls in line with the 1920s and 30s when poultry farming was really popular throughout the whole state. And you'll see a lot of chicken coops and poultry houses. If you travel along the back roads, you see them because they usually have a lot of those windows for the chickens there. So the Prey farm was bought by the Kennard family along with the March estate, which is around the corner on Portsmouth Avenue, by the mom, who was Wilhelmina Kennard. She was from Brookline, Mass. She certainly came from a lot of money. She was divorced at the time, which was real interesting, but she bought the farm to be used by her sons, 3 sons, and they all studied agriculture in college. So Willem was from Yale, and he was part of the New York National Guard. Victor was a Harvard graduate, and he moved to New York, and this is where some of my spelling errors occurred. I apologize. But Reginald on the right, he was the one who studied agriculture at Cornell, and he was the one who was the primary farmer here. Interesting, there's a lot of history that wasn't necessarily told in the inventory form about Reginald. He had an estranged wife and son, and I think there was a lot of controversy in the newspapers at the time about their divorce because of the money that the family had. So the estranged wife and son lived on this farm from 1921 until they divorced in 1923. And again, this idea of wealthy folks purchasing farms, coming to New Hampshire in the early 20th century is definitely in line with what we know about our state's history. By the late 1900s, the early farming trends in the state, folks were moving out to the Midwest. There was better soil there, larger land to purchase, and our farms were really starting to decay. And a lot of folks were just abandoning their farms, moving out of the state, and realizing that, hey, we really need to have a good population in our state. The legislature came up with a Farms for Summer Homes program in around 1900, because at that time there were over 1,500 vacant farms statewide. And so they developed over the next 32 years these annual advertising booklets that showed the different farms that were for sale throughout the state, that wealthy folks could come in and use for gentleman farms or second homes. And we don't know if the KENNARD family utilized one of these books, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised. They were certainly well marketed to exactly these types of people who would come here and use the property. And as I mentioned, Reginald was very into the poultry farming, and this is the brooder house that was mentioned by Cory earlier and was converted into apartments in the 1950s. So Reginald, he liked to use the white leghorns, kind of like the foghorn leghorn character. And instead of the Rhode Island Reds, he had 200 hens that had over 200 eggs a year. And he also was starting to raise turkeys in 1928. And the first year he had those turkeys, there were about 140 birds, but they were hoping for 400 to 500 for the next year. This brooder house had rooms for incubating and hatching the eggs and raising the young birds. And I know that Reginald had used some of his scientific knowledge from Cornell. With that, there were ways to have those birds live longer than a lot of other folks in the way they were doing it. So this was to prevent disease and other things from getting those birds early on. So here's our picture of our barn again. And as we noted earlier, it's probably around this time that the ventilation and some of the changes to the barn occurred to tighten it up so that there was interior warmth for the birds and animals. But you needed that ventilation so that there wasn't a lot of moisture that would cause the hay to decay, or even prevention of rust and rot of the building materials. So here's just some nice views of it from multiple sides. When we are talking about the rehabilitation and the reconstruction of property, of the buildings on the property here, I think it was, the idea is that the barn is not in the best shape, and that it probably will come down, and there'll be a sort of a picnic visitor center type facility in its place. And, you know, we talked about ideas of maybe reutilizing these ventilators or other elements of the barn in the new design. And while I think that there are certainly ways we can do that, when we are working with Fish and Game, we don't want to replicate a building to look exactly like the barn, nor do we want the new building to look so historic that it confuses people. We want it to be of its own time and place, which is what the Secretary of the Interior standards call for. But we certainly would like to harken back and utilize things that we can to keep it within its setting and to have it blend in and not look completely out of character. So we'll be working on that. So in addition to the poultry farm, they had an orchard of high-grade apple trees. And here's that same image on the left that was presented earlier with the buildings. And you can see some remnants of those apple trees and some of the other vegetable beds to the bottom of the picture. And as I mentioned, as gentlemen farmers, they were supported by their mother. And so they were having a pretty good time making a go of the farms in this time period when other farms in the area were really being abandoned. Because between 1926 and 1930, the number of farms in Greenland was reduced by half. But I think they had a little bit of help here so they can continue with their experimental work they were doing. But by around 1933, they had abandoned the farm. I don't know, or they weren't really using it like they were. I don't know if there was some family strife or other issues. But the Emery family, who we really know the name of the farm now because they owned it for most of the 20th century, came to live here, and they purchased the farm in 1934. And they have a real interesting history here that, again, falls in line with the historic context of what was going on nationally. There's a really interesting book called Saltwater Farm that one of the women who grew up here wrote. It's kind of a little memoir, and it's really fun, although there's some fictional information in there, so you can't really use it as documentation, but it's fun to look at. But what happened was their family was living in Massachusetts during the Great Depression. The father had a stenotype company business in Boston, but they didn't want to rely on government assistance or anything like that during the Depression. And they had a real keen interest in farming and had learned a lot about it through agricultural bulletins. And their dream was to find a farm and to move away from this urban area so that they could make a go as a self-sufficient type farm. And again, I don't know if, I think what it's said is that they were really driving around on some of their business up in New Hampshire and happened to find the farm and were real intrigued by it. And so they were able to purchase the buildings and 30 acres of meadow in 1934. And they farmed the land for their own consumption. They tried various really creative ways to make the farm self-supporting. They had a large garden and orchard. They canned food for the winter. They kept a cow for milk. And in the first year, they too bought 200 chicks and established a flock of chickens using the coop and brooder house that were already on the property. And here's just some really nice views of the landscape, which really places those buildings in a beautiful setting. In the winter, it was alluded to that smelt fishermen would come to the property, and this was a long tradition held there. So the family realized they could capitalize on that and charge a minimal amount for folks to park on the property. They rented ice shanties that they could haul in and out of the property, and they had bait for sale. So this is a really great image from that time period, 1936, showing those farm cars that are parked in front of the farm in the driveway area near the barn. So basically, Dorothy Emery, who was the mom, she ran the farm with her father, who moved with them there. He had been born in Nova Scotia and grew up in Dover. He was a carpenter, so he helped a little bit out. He was divorced from his second wife, and he was quite the character, the memoir tells. But he actually had a bedroom up in the attic, and this is a picture of the bathroom up in that attic space, which I think is really quaint with a lot of its original finishes. So that room could be attributed to the grandpa, who was greatly loved with the family. So here we are with the cabins that we touched on a little bit earlier. For additional income, they really capitalized on this bayside location. And by the 1930s and 40s, tourism was definitely becoming a real popular industry in New Hampshire and certainly the seacoast area. And so these shorefront camps and cabins were popular on Great Bay, but from the 1920s and the 40s. And I actually had a lovely opportunity to work with Cory Riley and the folks there on another property in Stratham that was a camp along Great Bay. And so there certainly are a lot of traditions of those. Boating and fishing were popular, hunting for waterfowl in season. So farmers built these groups of cottages on Weeks and Brackett Road off Bayside Road and on Fabian Point in Newington. And oftentimes they were rented to families from Boston and even from the Portsmouth area. And the second and third cottages were completed by the spring of 1941. And they had fireplaces. You can see the top picture here. They're in rough shape now, but you can still see some of those elements. The bottom picture shows someone who had done some painting of the landscape there as a mural. They had flush toilets and showers, gas and electricity, and they were advertised in the Portsmouth Herald early on as suitable for several men or small families in the summer. They were rented out for $30 to $40, or for the whole season, $250. But by the mid-1940s, the area was seeing a lot of growth, and they decided to winterize the buildings and rented these year-round to the shipyard workers. And by that point, they really didn't have to advertise very much because they were getting folks left and right to move here. You can see from the aerial image that by that time period, the 1950s, there was a lot of new development. Pease Air Force Base was really close by, and that brought in a lot of workers who needed housing. So there was a housing shortage, and that's the time when they decided to go ahead and change the Bruder House to apartments. But Frank Emery was originally definitely against the construction of Pease. He was worried that the large planes would be a problem for recreation in the area. But I think he changed his tune after he got a contract with the government to hay the fields there. So he realized there was some economic abilities there to make some money. Here's that Bruder House that was converted in the 1950s. And it was remodeled into 5 apartments by a carpenter hired by the family. And again, this was advertised in 1955 for motel type 2-bedroom apartments overlooking Great Bay. And you know, again, they didn't have to do much because they were just getting such a interest in these. They were filled for most of their history, even into the modern time. So the Emery family's farming, dairy farming had expanded to a herd of 20 to 30 cows, and they had 1 or more hired hands during the 20th century. In 1950, they purchased another 60-acre farm with buildings just over the line at 320 Newington Road. And this property provided additional barn space and hay fields. And the calves and heifers were kept there, and the house was occupied by a farm manager. But by the late 1950s, the entire dairying operation was moved to that Newington farm, and dairying came to an end about 1966 when Frank retired from the business. But he did continue to hay the property and sell that to horse stables in the area. And finally, at the end, I think Cory already alluded to the fact that there was a life estate on the property for about 20 years, and that was from Priscilla Emery Wykes. She lived with her parents until 1969 when she married, and she and her husband lived in the Middle Cottage for a while. Her brother, who had been in the service, lived in Hawaii for a number of years, but he returned to the farm in the 1990s as a caretaker, and they lived on the land until July, 2018 when David died. And so now we're here to talk a little bit more, I think, with Cory's back. Is she back?
I'm back, and I will start sharing my screen and we can take it from there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to put myself on mute for now.
Okay, great. Can everybody see the presentation in front of them? Is there a, yeah, great. Okay, so all I want to do right now is tell you a little bit about what our plans are and what we're going to try to achieve with the NOAA funding that we received, and also in partnership with the Division of Historic Resources. So what we'd like to do is remove some of the structures that are in bad shape. Right now, they're a real vandalism threat for the department, and we don't have a great applicable use for most of the residential space. But as has been discussed, we are committed to renovating the farmhouse and using that for researcher housing. We also are going to try to relocate the one cottage that's in good shape and build a picnic pavilion. We are working with other divisions within Fish and Game to create a boat access spot right here. We're going to hopefully build a garage to store some of the Great Bay NERR equipment. That's a limitation at our current site where we have our visitor center. We're hemmed in by the rail line, so we don't have very much land. And we're going to do some site work to create a small parking lot and perhaps some walking paths and some kiosks that interpret not just the history, but also the natural history of the site. So just to go through that in a little bit more detail for everybody, the buildings that are probably going to need to be taken down are those with an X through it. The 3 with red are properties that we would like to take down, and they probably won't be a part of our next phase of development. Again, a lot of this is still in negotiation with the Division of Historic Resources, but our ultimate vision is to open up this side of the property where the cabins are now and the apartment is now, and have that be a place where there will be parking still there, especially if we develop a boat launch, but also so that it's wide open, so that when you walk over that side, it's an open view, people can picnic, you can walk, and it really provides sort of that beautiful vista that is just gorgeous, and we can't wait to connect people to. The two yellow X's represent the garage and the barn, and those structures are not in good shape, but we hope, as Nadine mentioned, to use this space and the footprint of it to create a pavilion, a picnic pavilion, and potentially some bathrooms in this space, likely in this configuration, so it maintains its sort of historic massing on the landscape. Notice the cabin that does not have an X through it. And if you remember through some of the initial slides, there's one cabin that was rebuilt fairly recently. This is not considered a historic structure, but it is where a cabin was historically. That's in good shape and could be used in the future. Right now, a conservation officer lives there and has been keeping an eye on the property. And that type of caretaker role is probably going to be necessary in the future. So our proposal is to move that cabin over to another part of the site so that we don't have people living in the middle of where people are potentially picnicking or, launching kayaks, etc. So our hope is to move that to a different part of the site. And then we also would like to, I'm pointing out things that we hope to build. So we hope to build, as I said, a picnic pavilion and bathrooms somewhere in the vicinity of where the current garage and barn are. We will be working very closely with Nadine and with the Department of Administrative Services to make sure that those structures are appropriate to the history of the site. And then the other green structure circle that you see is where we are proposing to put the garage. Again, we sort of want to separate where that modern looking cottage and the garage are from where the historical aspects of the site are and where we're going to be encouraging some public spaces. And then finally, as Nadine mentioned, we're really excited to renovate the farmhouse. We don't plan on it looking too different, although we will have to make some adjustments to make it ADA compliant, etc. And so we'll be working to hopefully restore some of the external historic aspects, have more history appropriate windows and siding if possible. And we're hoping to maintain the aspects of that building that do give it its historical character right now. As mentioned, things like the fireplace and the stairplace. But we're really in the very infant stages of that work. But that's why we have been working with the Division of Historic Resources right from the start to get that input early and to make sure that NOAA, our federal partner, our state agency, and the engineers that we start working with understand that vision from the get-go. And finally, I just sort of wanted to say that, Nadine mentioned that we're working right now on a memorandum of understanding with NOAA to get our commitment to preserving the historic resources sort of in writing and prescribe sort of how we're going to do that. That will also cover the archaeological resources on site to make sure that we're protecting those as well. We look forward to working with the Division of Historic Resources, and as she mentioned, hopefully the Preservation Company to continue to advise us as we move forward with the design of the buildings. And we are very committed and have always been committed to interpreting our cultural history around Great Bay. So we will be incorporating the very rich information that we found out about this property and about the history of, farms around this area into our educational exhibits and kiosks at the site. So I am hoping that the first parts of this project can start happening this spring, and we have a completion date by around June of 2023. And I just want to acknowledge that commitment to interpreting the cultural history of Great Bay has been a part of our organization for a long time. And thanks to a lot of the people who are on this call, like Kelly Laughlin, our education director, and Beth Heckman, our assistant education director, and also long-term volunteers like Sheila Roberge and several others who have just maintained a really strong connection to our history. So I want to acknowledge all of that I think has made this a great project and a great fit for us. So with that, I think I will wrap up and I'll turn it over to Melissa to maybe moderate any questions that have come in through the chat box. Melissa?
Yeah, so before I ask the couple of questions that have come through, I just want to remind people, if you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box. I want to make sure we get everyone's questions answered. And I think the two questions we have now, Cory, are both for you. The first one is from Kenny, and for a while we were calling the property Glens Cove, and now it's Glen Cove, so he was just curious about the name change.
Sure. So I think I'll expand the answer a little bit. This group of wildlife management areas was called Great Bay Farms for a long time. But right around the same time that this property converted to Fish and Game Management, it was recognized that the farm across the street is actually it's a working farm, and it's called Great Bay Farm. And so there was a little bit of conflict there. And so the department decided that it would like to rename the wildlife management areas, this whole block of wildlife management areas. And that's done through a team in Concord called the Lands Team of New Hampshire Fish and Game. And we have representation on that, but it's also an agency-wide group. So Glens Cove was the original name that group had picked. But then a few months later, they decided to change it to Glen Cove, the folks on the lands team. So that's a little bit of history there. I'm not exactly sure of all the reasons why, but it's basically, I think, just that people felt it was a little easier to long-term moving forward to not have the apostrophe S. I hope that's a satisfactory answer, Kenny.
And the next question is from Deb, and she was curious, how many acres of land does the reserve manage?
So overall, we manage around 2,400 acres of land around Great Bay. This parcel, the overall parcel size that goes from the bay all the way to the road is, I think, around 26 acres. This part that has all the buildings and has been maintained in this way is around 12 acres.
Great. Dale is wondering if any part of the property will be open for walking before June 2023.
Okay, that's a great question, and we get people calling us all the time. People can't wait to get out there. The struggle right now is just that we have all of these vacant buildings that are in rough shape. So we do have a gate up right now, and the conservation officer sort of keeps an eye on things. My hope was that if we could try to get some of the derelict structures under control, that we could start opening it up to the public, but that will be a conversation with the lands team. We don't currently have the staff on our own organization to have somebody over there all the time. So we're relying on this conservation officer to keep an eye on it when he's off duty. So we hope to open that up to the public as soon as we can. And we also have had a few small events to show the property to the Great Bay stewards, to our volunteers. And it would be great to be able to, once COVID threats are under control, to open it up to some other public walks, even during the construction or as we're designing things. So it is my hope that we can have some organized events to show it to the public within, the next 6 months or a year, as soon as it's safe to do so. And then generally opening it up to everybody might take a little bit longer until we get the derelict structures under control.
Okay. Great. We did have another public access question from Kenny, but I think you answered it within that answer as well. Amy is just wondering what MOA stands for.
It's a memorandum of understanding or agreement, a memorandum agreement.
So for under section 106, when we have an adverse effect, we usually like to codify any sort of agreements we have to resolve those adverse effects with the federal agency. And what's nice about the MOAs is that typically once they're executed by all parties, the project can move forward, and the applicant has 3 to 5 years to actually complete the stipulation, but they can start working on their project. They don't have to have all that done before they can move forward with their project. So we try and find ways to, document properties before they come down so they can move forward with that MOA. And it's just a good tool that we use.
Great, thank you. And also, how could somebody find out more about the Great Bay Stewards and the work they do for the Bay?
So Melissa, I'm going to have you go ahead and put the Great Bay Stewards website right into the chat so everybody can click there right now, join, and donate. The Great Bay Stewards have been incredibly helpful. We needed conceptual designs in order to submit the proposal, and the Great Bay Stewards funded that work for us to make this project happen. So they are incredible partners, and they've been really helpful all along the way with this project. And I have no doubt that we'll be leaning them in the future as well.
I think we're so lucky in New Hampshire and with the state to have so many friends groups who volunteer their time and efforts on so many of our historic sites and properties and special places. And I know we couldn't do it without those groups, that's for sure.
Agreed. That is it for questions. No one else is typing anything else, so I think that's it. We had a great turnout today. It's pretty comparable to what our normal in-person lunch and learns would be, so that's great. And I hope everybody learned something new and is excited to one day see this property.
Yes, and I'll just say that we did record this, so we hope to make it available, and so check back with us over the next couple of weeks if you're interested in sharing this with other people that you know.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Nice job, Melissa.
Thank you. Kelly's having some trouble. I thought I ended the meeting for everybody when I left. Like, that's what I clicked.